Coming at you live from the TRP bunker. Good to see you. What is representation? I'm going to give you an example of what we cover in class. What is representation? Let's take a look at the word. Represent. Represent. Just think about that for a second. This is the kind of exercise I do with my students. I'm just giving you something to do today, in case you needed something to do, in case you want something to do. Representation of an individual to what? If you present something like a present, okay, that's the word present. If you present a present, a gift, it makes sense to ask to who, right? It's to something. Represent what to what? It's a little puzzling how this is supposed to work. U.S. representatives are members of Congress. Of course, senators are members of Congress too. A lot of people don't talk that way. They don't say members of Congress meaning the senator, but a senator is a member of Congress as well. See Article 1, Section 1. A Congress shall consist of a House of Representatives and a Senate. So both are members of Congress. They're supposed to represent something. But how is it possible to represent an individual? And then you have to wonder, to what? To the government, to the executive branch, to the judicial branch, to a foreign nation. How is it possible for a man to represent a woman? And I'm assuming you know what those words mean. I think a sufficient reason to be highly critical of a vote for Democrats is because I don't think that it's a good reason to vote for somebody just based on gender. I don't know anybody that's voting for Trump because he's a man. I don't know anybody. And I know a lot of Republicans. I've never seen that anywhere in writing. But I know a lot of people that are voting for Kamala, or Kamala, however you say her name, because she's a woman. But those same people, if you were to ask them what a woman is, they would pretend not to know. They would be hesitant to say the correct definition, which they know, in public, as if that's wrong. To know what the definition of a woman is, the correct definition, the one that they believe, the one that they're using. That is an indication to me of such a fundamental flaw that that party would be untrustworthy on virtually any other topic. I don't think you should shame people for things they shouldn't be ashamed about, like knowing what the definition of a woman is, especially when that's what you're taking yourself to base your vote on. And you're pretending to believe that a man cannot represent a woman in the relevant respect required by law, required by our tradition. Likewise, you would have to believe that a woman could not represent a man. Unless you don't believe that there's any difference between those two things, in which case, how could that possibly be a reason to vote on the basis of gender if there's no difference between a man and a woman? But there's this deeper issue there of representation beyond the issue of pretending not to know what a definition is. I think a lot of Democrats have gotten to the point where they've talked themselves into thinking that they don't really know the definition of a basic term like woman. And that's probably just as concerning as pretending not to know, even when you do. Let's talk about Congress. Would you mind? Let's talk a little bit about Congress today. If you're looking for something to do, something productive, can I give you an assignment? I would give you this assignment. There's a podcast, not mine. Mine's fine too, but there's a podcast called Understanding Congress. April 6th, 2023. Understanding Congress, that's the name of the podcast. April 6th, 2023. Pull that podcast up on Apple Podcasts and save that episode. If you can get to it today, that would give you something to do. It's about a half hour. That episode, I've collated through those episodes. That is one of the best ones for your bang for your buck right there. And I don't necessarily agree with the guy that is interviewed in that podcast episode on everything. He said something that sounded pro-choice to me. But he was so good on everything else, I forgave him his pro-choice nonsense. He was excellent on 97% of what he was saying in that podcast. And that is a deep teaching on that episode, April 6th, 2023, Understanding Congress, published by AEI. Okay? That would be my assignment to you today if you wanted something to do to move the ball forward in our obligations to be in charge of America. The people are in charge here. And if the people are in charge and they're grade inflated, well, we're going to have huge problems. If the people are in charge and the people don't have an attention span, we're going to have huge problems. So this is a good exercise for you to do. Wade through the issues in that episode and see if you can come up with something that would be worth talking about and discussing. Maybe it would change your mind on some things about Congress. And I don't want to rehash what that guy says. I do in class. But I guess what I'll say here is that in my experience, the American people are so far behind in basic politics understanding that the frustrating thing for me is we never get to what would really help move forward because we're so stuck on some other things. And you might be thinking, I know what you're stuck on. And my guess is you probably don't. You're too far behind. You probably have no idea what I'm talking about. And that's really sad for me. It's not just sad because I have nobody to talk to, which is true. But it's sad because the real issues that could be solved, there's not enough focused attention on those issues. And some of it is just the nature of what we have here. We have a lot of fragmentation. Let me give you something else to chew on. There's another episode of that Understanding Congress podcast about how many members are in the House of Representatives. That number has not changed in over 100 years. It's 435. Wow, can you imagine that? 435 U.S. representatives. That has not changed in over 100 years. Now, 100 years ago, we had quite a smaller population here in the United States. The population has skyrocketed in the United States, and the number of representatives has stayed the same. What does that mean? Well, it means that old school politics, what do I mean by that? Getting to know your constituents. Like if I was a legislator, this is what I would want to do. I would want to talk to people that voted against me. I would want a list of all the Democrats, and I would randomly pick, with the help of staff, different homes, and I would want to go to people's homes and say, what is important to you? What might I be missing? How can I represent you? Because the greatest risk is that I, as a Republican, will miss something in my duty to represent people who voted against me. And so I would want to establish relationships and just be genuine and be myself. No photo ops, nothing like that, nothing on social media, just human to human interaction. That's how it used to be. Well, the number of representatives, U.S. representatives, have stayed the same in over 100 years, while the population has drastically increased. So now there's this weird situation where some U.S. representatives represent more people than a U.S. senator does representing a state. How are you supposed to represent 700,000 people? How is that possible? In a 2-year term, what exactly, how are you going to carve out that time to discuss anything with anybody effectively on a personal basis and have enough time to get to know people? You can't do it through email. People don't read email and nobody takes it seriously. I get emails from my legislature people and the people of the other party, and they're genuinely crafted fine, but I don't have any trust that they actually want to get to know me or listen to what I have to say. And see, that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about that personal. How do you represent somebody that you've never even met? You know? Now, what do? Do we increase the number of U.S. representatives? Okay. You're going to have to make a bigger building. You're going to have to, and by the way, that's an interesting construction project in a city. What do you want to do? Double it? You could double the number of congressmen so that they only represent 300,000 people, but you're still presented with an enormous number of people that you're supposed to represent. And by the way, represent to who? To what? A lot of people don't even understand that. In my view, the Congress member, the House member, is supposed to represent you to the federal government. That is to say, to the executive branch. And that's still happening in some sense. I haven't even started talking about the staff of Congress. Don't even get me started. Congress has cut its own staff. Congress members have fewer staff, House members have fewer staff now than they did 30 years ago, while the government has grown in size. These are just some of the issues that you're talking about. What do we do to solve this? Do we keep increasing the size of Congress? No. I prefer keeping the Senate the same because I think that the states need to be equally represented. But I think there's a lot of confusion about what it even means to represent a state to the federal government. What interests do states have? If the voters think that senators are supposed to represent them individually or their group, their demographic, I don't know anybody that thinks in terms of states, in terms of voting. When you vote for U.S. Senator, do you think I want this person to represent my state? Or are you thinking in terms of individually, I want them to represent me as an individual, or my my skin color, or gender? What does it mean to represent somebody's skin color to the federal government? I don't even know what that means. The same people will be offended by stereotypes, or pretend to be offended by stereotypes, depending on what you mean by a stereotype. But I think typically what people mean by a stereotype is just a description of a group that's based in some kind of empirical. It's post-judice, it's not prejudice. It's after experience, it's not before experience. Otherwise, what would there be in the stereotype? The stereotype has to have something that people understand from based on experience. Well, if you're just talking about describing things in your experience and being honest about it, and then you want that to be represented to the federal government, what exactly does that even mean? I'm not going to talk about the court today, the judiciary, although I think in some ways the judiciary is probably the easiest one to talk about. It's the low-hanging fruit. One reason is the judiciary has an archive that is probably the easiest to follow for people that want to dig in and burrow in there and discover new and exciting things. They're called orders, decisions, opinions, and they're archived well in law books, and so you can dig in there and figure things out. It takes a long time. Don't ask me how I know. But it's a lot harder to do that with Congress. It's a lot harder to do. What's the archive of Congress? It's so complicated. You have 435 U.S. House members, each representing about 700,000 people. Then you have the U.S. Senate. There's 50 states, 2 senators. You have staggered elections, bicameral legislature. Term limits are different. The term, what I mean is not by term limit, I mean terms are different. 100% of the House is up for re-election every 2 years. 1/3 of the Senate is. And sometimes you have special elections like what we do now in California. We have two, essentially, I voted for the same person twice for U.S. Senate. It's a little odd because it's a special election. It's a lot to keep track of what each of those people believe, what they're on record about. And it's even more complicated when it's not like there's the number of the amount of legislation is less than it used to be, but the number of bills is less because there's a tendency nowadays to try to fold almost everything into, as much as you can, into these budget bills where they're like 3,000 pages, and nobody can keep track of that, especially even people in Congress can't keep track of that. So how are you supposed to, as a citizen, keep track of that amount of information? In terms of the presidency, a lot of what the president does is secret. Some of the most important things that the president does is not meant for public consumption on purpose and for good reason. I had a top secret clearance when I was 19 years old, and that experience taught me that the executive branch does things that are, I think, rooted in legitimacy, and for that reason they're hard to keep track of by, average everyday people voting. I think it's impossible to keep track of even if you have a clearance. I remember constantly getting emails, and I had one of the first my first email address was an NSA email address in the 90s. I have printouts. I didn't even know this until recently when I was reading the printouts in my archives and I saw the NSA email address that I had. And I thought, wow, I didn't even realize that was my first email address. I was constantly getting stuff that I didn't really look at because I didn't want to look at it. It was too much information. And I had a compartmented clearance. It's called Sensitive Compartmented Information, SCI, TSSCI. And that was just the compartments that I was read into and able to look at. The amount of unclassified material related to these issues of foreign relations that the president deals with is overwhelming. It's overwhelming to try to keep track of it, and it's overwhelming to understand what it means in terms of what to do. And that's just one branch. I mean, we talked about judiciary, you talk about Congress, you talk about the presidency, the executive branch. And I'm talking about the stuff that the executive branch does related to the Commander-in-Chief Clause of the U.S. Constitution, Article 2. I'm not talking about the executive branch stuff that is relatively new and some of it illegitimate that you'd have to keep track of. And that stuff's not secret, generally speaking. That's overwhelming to keep track of. You see a trend here. Just in terms of foreign relations, the president receives ambassadors. That's in the Constitution. Well, that means that the president has the primary function in our government of dealing with all these other countries. How many other countries are there? I'll wait. What are their capital cities? What languages do they speak? What are the ethnicities involved? What about religion? What kind of security issues are happening right now? What should the budget be for dealing with this country rather than that country? What is the budget right now for dealing with this country rather than that country? I could give you a task that would take you years to complete. It's a lot for anybody to keep up with, and I frankly don't think even the president can do it. I don't think the Secretary of State can do it. It's an overwhelming task for any person to know. And if you're telling me that as a citizen who wants to be represented to the government or to foreign nations, if you can't answer these questions of how many countries there are and these basic countries and what the budget is and all that stuff or what it should be, how is it legitimate that your interests or what you think should be represented to the government at all? This is the kind of stuff I cover in class. A lot of what I do in class is I just try to give you a landscape of how huge these issues are. It is overwhelming. And when you try to stuff it all on social media, I mean, it's just, that's not going to happen. You're going to be distracted, probably. Sometimes it's effective for some purposes, but it's really hard to know if you're being distracted or if you're moving the ball forward in something that you need to understand. It's really hard to make that decision. Especially if you haven't even thought about what it even means in the first place to be represented in an individual capacity or a demographic capacity to the federal government, assuming you could even get that far and you know what you're supposed to be represented to. Representation is usually how it's pronounced, but I say representation is a difficult issue to get a grasp on. And maybe some of the extent that the government is blameworthy for is its attempt to represent you because you don't know what you're talking about. And if you are being represented, it would reflect itself in a government that is blameworthy just as much as you are for not understanding things. Now that's a humbling thing to get at. Hope I've given you something to think about here on November 5th, 2024. It's hard to know how to make progress. We're all interested in making progress. But how do you make progress if you don't have a command of basic things? And one of the things you need to have a command of is how hard it is to be a citizen in the United States. And see, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, but they're not really the issues involved. And the reason that a lot of folks want to steer away from the issues, if they happen to know what some of them are, is because it's just easier to steer away because it's so hard. It is difficult. Andrew, I see your comment. A republic if you can keep it. Yeah. Yeah, the founding fathers were aware of these problems. We are so blessed to have had framers and founders that understand some of these difficulties. And I'll share with you something even more here that I'm dealing with as a man, as a person, as an educator, is that there's no place for me anymore in this world as an educator. The model of student as customer has been disastrous for higher education. In the compulsory model of K through 12, there's been a little bit, I think, more hope in terms, but it's all dependent on the parents. The parents are the key in this whole thing. But in higher ed, I mean, you see it kind of on other things too, like in podcasting, you see it. There's this impatience that the public has, because the public has a view of itself as a consumer, as a customer, a consumer of information or understanding. The approach is that I'm here to get something for myself. But if, let's say you're starting on square one and you don't quite know what you don't even know, how are you going to make a decision about what you want or what you think you need? You can see that in education. I mean, you can see that with student evaluations. The episode I just posted yesterday, I go through student evaluations from one of my classes at Pepperdine, one of the first classes I taught there in 2007. And I make some little commentary about just how ridiculous student evaluations are and what the assumptions are behind them. Some of the evaluations were like internally contradictory, and it's just a bizarre thing to have a student evaluate a professor. And it's an interesting question of what that assumes about the nature of the educational experience, the classroom experience. I think it inculcates laziness in students over time. Maybe not synchronically, but diachronically, I think it does over time. It contributes to grade inflation. Whoever evaluates you is your boss. Analytically, that's true. I was noting in that episode yesterday that I was never invited to evaluate my chair or my dean or the president. That's because they were my boss. And, you know, they evaluate you. You don't evaluate them. It's top down. And in the university context with the classroom, if you call that top-down thing into question, you undermine the students' motivation to really learn. Because what they do is they bring in their expectations, and what their expectations are could include learning, but there's a fight that's happening inside of them. And the fight is to be lazy. They want prestige that comes with high grades for as little work as possible. And if a professor doesn't have absolute job security, the professor can be vulnerable if the professor has different priorities, meaning if the professor has a priority of taking this group of students where they are, which is way behind, and bringing them to a place that's advanced and making progress. But oftentimes you have to do that where they don't want to do work. Okay? So what are you supposed to do if they're evaluating you? And that's what they want. Over time, diachronically, and I think sometimes synchronically, this leads to grade inflation, and it's led to basically the pointlessness of higher education. It also leads to the pointlessness of the bachelor's degree. There's some different issues here in terms of how much it costs. Also, how many degrees do you need? Like, used to be that a bachelor's degree was considered like educated. Like, you were educated if you got a bachelor's degree from an awesome college. This is back before grade inflation. Well, now, I don't know anybody that believes that. There's a lot of pressure to get a master's degree or to get some other credential on top of that. And it's very odd. Why would you have to get a credential on top of your degree to teach K through 12? I mean, what was the problem with your degree? I mean, that this credential is going to fix. Why not just put that into the degree? And we're just wasting people's time. We're extending adolescence further and further into adulthood, while at the same time, I think the pressure to make a living is encroaching. The ability to make a living is encroaching. And at some point, this is just going to break. The world is far too complicated to be wasting time like this. What we should do instead is we should just have college be really hard. And if you want to go there, great. And as soon as you show up, stop complaining, do the work. And you might say, oh, you don't have a voice or whatever. Well, sure you do. You could just drop out of college. But let's just stop lowering the quality of college. Bachelor's degree work 50 years ago was what master's degree work is that like now. So, I mean, if you don't inflate grades, what place is there for you? What place is there for someone like me? And education, you can't just ditch it. It has to be there because of the nature of our republic. Our republic sorry, Andrew, I can't read it. This is why it must be you. Oh, keep holding the line. Thank you, brother. Thank you. Our republic requires excellent education, not the kind we have. We have to graduate people that know how to read from high school. And not only know how to read, but enjoy reading. That expect to read a lot. That have the internal discipline to carve it out. That, in the words of Chad Wright, he's a Navy SEAL on YouTube that I follow, 3 of 7 project. The video I watched today, he was the title of the video was "What to Do When Things Get Hard." Advice from a Navy SEAL. It was 5 minutes, and his advice was, don't be a pussy. Um, yeah, I mean, you may not like the way he phrased that. I'm going to interpret him as saying, don't be a pussycat. But I think what he just means is, I'm pretty sure that's what he means, because he's a Christian and he's not foul mouthed for no reason. He doesn't cuss actually at all. So I think that's what he means, is like just cowering, just pretending like there's nothing we can do. There are things we can do to make things better. And a lot of it has to do with coming to understand the basics, having a command of the basics, so that we can discern better where we should be putting our time and how to move things forward. I mean, like, again, if I was a legislator, if I found myself in the legislature because there was a fluke and there was a spot that opened up that nobody was running for, or nobody was available for, and I won, because that was what it would take, like a miracle for that to happen. And I found myself in the legislature. What I would want to do is, I don't think I would even show up to the legislature for a while. I think I would just talk to people. I would get some staff around me, and I would get a map of the district that I'm supposed to represent, and I would talk mostly to people that disagreed with me. And I would try to establish relationships of trust where I would say, hey, look, I'm not going to vote for abortion. You can just expect that. I'm not going to vote to violate the Second Amendment or free exercise. If you think I'm establishing a religion somewhere, I want to know what you think about that. I don't want to violate the First Amendment. I don't want to violate any of the Constitution. So keep me on the ball for that. But most of the issues don't really have to do with that. They're typically budgetary issues about what government agencies should or shouldn't be doing with money, and how that affects people's lives, like the economy. That's the big thing. And I do want to hear what people have to say about that, because there's people that are in industries that I don't know anything about, and there are people that have life experience that I don't know anything about, and so that, not on social media, no headline crap, no Twitter crap, just talking to people, building relationships. That's the way forward. The old school politics, it's got to be old school. And it's got to be old school with education too. The way forward is to look back. Because right now, it's a disaster. It is an absolute disaster. I mean, the Atlantic article, like, what was it, like 5 weeks ago, said that, quote unquote, elite students can't even read a book. They can't even read. This is at Columbia University. They can't even read. Elite does not mean elite anymore. It means easy and grade inflated. And I'm being nice, because it also means Democrat. That wouldn't be my first foot forward in talking to constituents. I would really seriously wonder if they understand the issues like I understand them, and I would pay close attention to see if there's a way forward. We need to go back. We need to take a look at what worked in the past and try to improve on it, to try to ameliorate some of the problems that we see now. The biggest problem, hands down, is ignorance. Ignorance of basic things. That's why I spend most of my time in class these days trying to shore up people on basic things and try to get them to be honest that if they don't know basic things, and how to figure out how to shore that up and leave my class with at least basic things. That's what I got for you today. Happy election day to you. I enjoyed this time hanging out with you.